PSMA, first of all, we're a very interesting organisation. We aggregate location data, maps if you like. So it's Dan the Map Man, and that's the best way to remember me, but our focus is to take all the location data that currently governments collect as a byproduct of a whole lot of service delivery, and in fact we've seen an excellent example with Seth and John in terms of what's happening with Registers of Scotland. And of course, same thing happens in Australia, and there are many byproducts of that information. But within a federation, we need a means of aggregating that information at the national level. So our focus is to do exactly that. And so we're a specialist in information aggregation, location data in particular, and in fact, we are the premium supplier of a whole range of fundamental location data sets. And you may scratch your head and say, yes, but we're talking about privacy and security, Dan, you're in the wrong room. In actual fact, we've mentioned location implicitly in every session today, and in fact there is a very significant assumption that high quality location data exists and is available to underpin a whole range of security, privacy and service delivery needs. But in fact, that assumption can actually trip you up, and our focus is to make sure that doesn't happen. So PSMA is aiming at making sure that fundamental data at the national level is there to support all of these other activities. And Dawn stole my thunder when she mentioned... No, not at all. When she mentioned the release of GNAF as recently as last week, working in close collaboration with Prime Minister and Cabinet, we now have access to a world-leading geocoded address data set to underpin a whole range of these related service delivery challenges. I feel like I'm stealing too much time, John. Would you like me to pull the pin there?
Well, no, but I might throw to Dawn on that as well. I mean, we spoke about, and indeed, analytics by design is starting to occur. How does, how does government agencies start to think about this concern potentially as data collides and starts to impart more value? What concerns and considerations do you go through?
Well, I guess the concerns about privacy and security are paramount, as I was talking about from New South Wales Government and the initiative around the Data Analytics Centre, then that's very explicitly been built in up front, a clear commitment that this is not about creating sort of new data lakes in government in which we sort of pour in everybody's data, stir it up and see what comes out, but that it's actually about trialling and piloting new analytics tools and techniques that can give us insights to inform, new services, policy priorities, and really tackling some of the challenges that governments face, but in ways that are using the best of the capability that's available to develop new methodologies, try new things, to do it in a way that maintains that trust between government and citizens, and harnesses the expertise and the opportunities that are becoming available through different technologies and research applications, etc.
Thank you. David, privacy by design, what does it actually mean? Is it a real term? How do you practically implement it in services, and should we be concerned?
Not insignificant questions, John, that can't be answered in an afternoon like this, I don't think, or in a panel session. Privacy by design is a series of principles developed by Anne Cavoukian, who was the Privacy Commissioner or Information Commissioner for Ontario. It's been adopted as an international benchmark. The materials if you Google privacy by design, you'll find all of the principles. I did it recently, and our site comes up third, I think, which is excellent, because we've adopted it as really the benchmark of good privacy practice in Victoria. Range of principles. Well, one of the most important principles, the last one, is keep it user-centric. And I was going to ask Stan the Map Man, evading your question, John. If my mobile phone, as it does, collects location data about me, and I don't consent no one's ever asked me to for my consent to give it to you. How's it used? How do you use it?
Well, we actually don't collect that information, so
Aha.
I'm pleased to say that I don't have to deal with that particular issue. But the organisations that we deal with that are involved in capturing what they call probe data, it's actually quite anonymous. So they actually, in most instances, there's actually two ways of doing this. One is it's completely anonymous and they simply identify where the phone signal is coming from, and that's referred to as probe data and actually plays a really important role in understanding traffic movements and traffic volumes, traffic issues. The other one is where there's an over-the-top application that is actually much more proactive in terms of capturing information, and in that instance there is much more likely to be some kind of authority given by the user to allow that information to be passed on to others. So there's actually a couple of ways that could occur.
And the third way is perhaps through law enforcement or national security using that data or mandating the collection of that data.
Yeah, and that's an area I'm not familiar with.
But I think it's worthwhile. I think it's worthwhile that we all understand, that multiple data sources are collected, and they are overlaid. I mean, some of the most sensitive information in Australia is geolocation information, and one of the principles of privacy by design is transparency. So a lot of the accountability and transparency mechanisms that you'd expect if you were consenting, or if you agree with my proposition that you have information self-determination, are issues that are opaque. You don't know who's collecting your data, you don't know how it's being shared around, etc., etc. And I think privacy by design, one of the key things, apart from being user-centric, is that there needs to be a degree of transparency about it. It's not just collecting data for the sake of it all. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, John, but it's a start.
It's opened up a bigger set of questions. Dawn, did you have?
And I just wanted to add to that, one of the issues we wrestle with is informed consent. We've already had reference this morning to, people clicking through, I accept terms and conditions, but they've never actually read those terms and conditions because they're kind of 45 pages long. And I think there's a lot of research about that similarly with privacy policies and statements on websites and all sorts of different kind of collection mechanisms. It's an ongoing challenge to make it transparent what the information is being collected for and purposes to which it very legitimately will be put. But maybe there's some opportunities in thinking about sort of a digital world and user-centric approaches, how we can do that differently.
I'm going to flip the question around now. And this morning, I've always, as a sort of an identity person, referred to people as users, and I've completely been ruined in using that term from Rachel from DTO. So what's the role of the citizen in protecting and administering their data, looking after it, staying in control? Because that is we're seeing some interesting trends in health records and many other data sources.
It's a problematic issue, John. I actually designed the regulatory system for e-health in Australia, and I swore black and blue to maybe people in this room at consultations that it would never be an opt-out system, it would always be an opt-in. And of course it's now an opt-out system in order to drive take-up of e-health, because $4 billion had been spent on it and no one had, very few people had registered. In my view, that's a fundamental breach of trust, and just puts simple economics against or opposes it to information self-determination. And it says something about trust across government, that those sort of principles would be thrown away simply because a system is not being used as much as it should be. To answer the broader question, I don't think many of us in this room are equipped with the information that we're needed to protect ourselves online or to make decisions about how our information is used. What's our responsibility when many technology companies track every movement? The location sign on my phone comes on periodically, which tracks where I am. I could be tracked driving to work of a morning, where I go to for meetings, etc., etc. But I don't recall any document telling me that. So there's really not a lot for the citizen or for an individual, unless you're really, really savvy, to look into those sorts of issues. And I guess that's one of the reasons you have regulators like me who ask those sort of questions. At the same time, there's a really, really strong case for better research and for using de-identified information in order to provide better diagnostic services, better traffic flows. A whole range of information that can usefully be de-identified to do all of those sorts of things. And that, I guess, is where the panel discussion about big data reaches a pointy end, but I'll stop there.
I guess, and this is perhaps a personal view more than a New South Wales government review, that the protection of personal information is an aspect of privacy has never been deemed to be absolute, and all of the sort of privacy frameworks have been about ensuring that there's an appropriate balance of power between the legitimate use of personal information to provide a service or to manage a community, so policing, that kind of thing, and that right of individuals to the protection of their personal information. And I guess what I'd like to see sort of in the future is that through changing sort of technology, that there is perhaps an opportunity to rethink that balance of power and perhaps shift it more in favour of the citizen, so that they actually, at the moment they may not feel enabled to take control of that and to be clear about what is and isn't happening to their data and provide some kind of authorising environment for that, but that through advances in technology, through more customer-centric approaches, through sort of a changing digital environment, that we can actually shift that balance of power back in favour of the citizen, so that at the moment there are also a number of processes and services, etc., that require government or businesses to actually collect and hold data, and then it's about, you asking, well, what is it you've got and what are you planning to do with it? But in the future, it's quite likely that you don't need to collect that data. It may be held by the person and you just need access to it, or even you just need to some kind of verification that if a question is asked, that the answer is yes or no without ever. And perhaps, an example that's talked about is taxation. The Australian Tax Office holds a lot of data to verify whether you're paying the right tax. But all it wants to know is that you're paying the right tax. It doesn't necessarily need to know how much you earn. And again, there are all sorts of opportunities looking to the future of shifting that paradigm.
John Kavanagh said some interesting things about security a little bit earlier. And one of the things I found really interesting about what he said was having security travel with information rather than setting up firewalls and all of the rest of the security paraphernalia that goes on with it. And I wonder, just following on from your point, if we're capable of designing systems that allow us to share information, etc., etc., whether we can put that information back into our own hands in the same sorts of ways that he was talking about, that our personal information is protected at source, and we give various authorisations to deal with it. Now, there may be some circumstances where no authorisation is required, for example, in law enforcement or national security type circumstances. But in other circumstances, there's, I would have thought, every reason why we could design the relevant technical systems to do those sorts of things. And that's one of the opportunities we've got, and that's one of the opportunities that privacy by design and security by design gives us, and that is to design those systems with those areas of self-determination involved, and using technology as means of balancing some of the power imbalances, I suspect.
I might just open to the audience if there's any particular questions. Oh, lots of questions, yep.
Is that on? Catherine Ovington, I'm from the Privacy, Law and Policy Area, Attorney General's Department, Federal. We've talked a lot about IT and the assumption that every citizen is connected. I'm interested in how Dawn and David, how issues around accessibility for people who aren't connected. For instance, we still get a lot of ministerials from people that are handwritten, typed. People don't have email necessarily. How do you manage privacy with those sorts of citizens?
So I think equity of access is like a really important sort of principle of how governments operate. So I was talking about Service New South Wales as that kind of transactional shopfront in New South Wales, and one of the principles behind that has been that sort of putting the customer at the centre, and we've heard a lot about that today. And as part of that, it's been ensuring that the emphasis is on providing the optimised service, not requiring everyone to move online. So there are all sorts of cost advantages to transacting online, which governments like, but there's that strong recognition that it's about providing a level of customer service and therefore providing that service in the way that the customer wants to interact. And then the focus becomes on consistency of service regardless of the channel that you're using. So Service New South Wales has a strategy of rolling out actual sort of shop fronts where people can come in. They're provided a bit like the banks do, with some digital services in those shop fronts if that's what people want to do, but there's a concierge and there's face-to-face services where they can get help and advice. But I think sort of taking that question a bit more broadly, which is, how do you manage the protection of personal information in an offline world? I think in some ways we're actually better at that, because a lot of the paradigms that we talk about in terms of the privacy legislative regimes were really developed from paper-based thinking, and it's actually, if you try and unpick it, it's kind of implicit in some of those things about storage and use and disclosure, that really it's coming from that standpoint again that James was talking about earlier, which is about documents moving around and paper moving around, and it actually becomes a lot more challenging in the digital world, where we're talking about all sorts of different pieces of data that can be aggregated and used and whizzed around the world in ways that wasn't possible when a lot of the frameworks were developed and put in place. But then sort of extending that then is about thinking about how we ensure that in terms of the research and the aggregation and using data to design sort of new services and to think about better outcomes, we're making sure that that's informed by all of our user population, not just the digitally connected.
I've got a slightly different view. All privacy law really or information privacy law across the world is based on the OECD principles or the OECD 1980 principles. And they were developed in order to ensure that there was a free flow of electronic information. And it was perceived at the time, well, what was happening at the time is that European countries in particular wouldn't transfer their citizens' data to each other unless there was reciprocal protection. And it was realised by the OECD that we wouldn't actually get a take-up of electronic services, particularly in the finance and insurance sectors, unless there was a privacy framework. So information privacy was designed to do two things: to ensure that there was a free flow of information at the same time while respecting privacy. And that principle embodied in our legislation. When last I saw, it was in the Commonwealth legislation as well. In answer to your question about accessibility, it's a much underrated question and a much underrated issue in the country as governments attempt to drive costs down and ensure that businesses transacted online. We get to the point where, I mean, how many frustrating conversations have you tried to have with your bank, insurance company, telecommunications company? In fact, what I'm proposing to do is to have an answering service on my telephone in future, to say that when Telstra phones me or my bank phones me, say your call is important to me, but I'm otherwise engaged. In the meantime, select what you want to do from these 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 options, but I'm busy, and so listen to some music for a while.
1 or 2 more quick questions, Steve. Sorry, there we go.
Thanks. Steve Wilson from Constellation Research. Quickly, David, I couldn't agree more with your call, I guess, for innovation. Security and privacy. The typical sort of caricature is that privacy is at odds with innovation, but I think what we all want to see is innovation positively for privacy. But I've got a more critical question for you, which relates to privacy by design. I'm curious in how you reconcile user centricity with this age of big data. It occurs to me that probably maybe 90% of information about me flows behind my back unseen through big data. Now, I personally think that our existing privacy regime can deal with that if we're flexible. But I think the privacy by design has a rather quaint notion that transparency means that, or determination means that users need to be confronted by all that big data. And how practical is that going to be, and how do you reconcile that?
People are starting to talk about analytics by design. And I think my attitude is that the principles of privacy by design are probably elastic enough to actually take into account issues associated with big data. That said, there's a whole range of issues around big data, like the accountability of algorithms. I mean, would any of us been talking about accountable algorithms 3 or 4 years ago? Would any of us been talking about cultural bias in our algorithms? Would any of us have been talking about issues about data selection and what sort of data gets selected to put into the algorithms to be processed in entirely non-transparent ways by mathematicians who, I presume, don't have a deep background in public policy or social policy, etc., etc. And I said earlier today that the conversations that I'm hearing in this conference about privacy by design and security by design are just so gratifying because I don't think I've ever heard them in such a consolidated way across an informed group of people such as yourselves. But in the meantime, there are the new issues opening up. How do we question big data? How is it best used? How do we make sure that if we do a search for the name Marvin on Google, we don't get targeted ads for defence attorneys? Whereas if we did a search for George, we'd get ads for yachting shoes. So I think there's a whole range of issues that we need to excavate in relation to big data. We will be publishing a background paper on big data. I've got the draft there. It needs a little bit more work. No, I'm not giving it to you. But we're going to be looking at issues like algorithmic bias, like where does the data come from, how accurate is the data, and look if you want a guide from a regulator's view. Now, I'm all in favour of big data, but I'm all in favour of checks and balances. I'm all in favour of us having, the best technology that we can. But I'm all in favour of self-determination in relation to it. and I think all of those need to go into the debate. So there's some great things with big data. There's some very interesting questions about de-identification. And you know, my view about, without boring everyone senseless, is my view about big data is that there are no guarantees, about de-identification, is that there are no guarantees in life. There are no guarantees about the privacy of your information if it's stored in a filing cabinet. I think if we take reasonable and robust steps, but de-identification is one of the hottest topics in the privacy community. Many would disagree with me. The Europeans would disagree with what I say. And what I say is, yeah, we should. Nothing's guaranteed, but we should work out the ways that we can provide robust methods of de-identification. And sorry to talk for so long.
That's all right. Right. Unfortunately, time's up. Oh, we got one more. Last very quick question.
Hi, I'll try and be quick, I promise. So I'm Miranda from the ATO, and I just had a question just along the same vein from James's presentation previously. So I don't know if you guys feel you can answer it, but if you can't, then that's okay. I guess from a really selfish perspective, a lot of the work that we do in the security space within the ATO, we do from a business corporate perspective. And I guess the use of onshore and offshore clouds has really ramped up, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months, and the types of vendors that we're looking at using those services for. And I think my question is just around how and when do we expect that, I suppose, the Australian government's risk appetite around the use of offshore cloud is actually going to shift or increase? Because I think that was some of James's commentary, was that I guess he was challenging the current risk appetite around using offshore cloud, because we know that that's actually quite minimal at the moment. But I know that a lot of that sort of stuff really does align with, you know, community expectations and, you know, the government's policy at the time and all that sort of stuff. But I think I'm just curious to know how and when you guys think that some of those ideas might start to change.
Maybe 1 minute answer, if that's possible.
We published a guide or a background paper on cloud computing. It's on our website. My attitude to cloud computing is you take a risk-based approach. There's nothing in privacy that rules it out. But if it's top secret information, I think there are real problems in it going offshore. And I think there are real problems about jurisdictional issues. So FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of the US, reaches into any American corporation, wherever situated, and can actually take the data. So do we want Australian data in US servers when it's national security information?
And New South Wales probably has a slightly different approach. So we updated our cloud policy last year, but essentially that says it's okay to use cloud. You just it needs to be part of your agency business decision-making framework. Here's some things that you need to think about when you're doing that, and privacy and information risk is one of those dimensions. And I guess in the recent update, we tried to be sort of clear about, well, here's the sorts of commoditized services that people are already sourcing, agencies are sourcing from the cloud, so really, you know, is okay to use. I mean, we haven't gone to sort of whitelisting or taking those kinds of approaches, but certainly in New South Wales government, I mean, we don't hold the sort of dimensions of top secret information that you would get in the Commonwealth, but we have a very clear risk-based approach that says, you know, consider cloud as an option, and that's also recognising that, you know, you can actually get a lot of enhanced security from using cloud services.